Hi, and welcome back to Inside Paraplanning, the brand new podcast from the PFS Paraplanners. We're here to chat about all things paraplanning, from the quirks of suitability reports and the challenges of client vulnerability to the mysteries of cash flow modelling and everything in between. If you joined us for episode 1, you would have heard the wonderful Rob Kingsbury chatting to us about his time with Professional Paraplanner and his thoughts on how the paraplanning world is evolving. I'm Hannah Winnick from the PFS Paraplanning panel, and today I'm joined by my fellow panel members, Alan Gow and Laura McLeod, for a good old-fashioned natter about client vulnerability. So let's go. Hi, guys.
Good morning. Oh, it might not be morning when you listen to this, so it might just be hello.
Hello. So vulnerability, we hear this term a lot in paraplanning, but what does it actually mean?
It's a really good question. I think, I can't remember the exact definition, but it's along the lines of any client circumstance or characteristic that might put them in a position where they could be at harm. But what that really looks like, I think, varies a lot from firm to firm.
Yeah, I think it's a bit broader than it used to be considered. Like we used to consider someone had a medical condition or there was a certain defined set of circumstances that might make them feel more vulnerable, like a bereavement or a divorce. But I think we are encouraged to consider it a lot more widely now. So it can be a whole range of different situations. It can be temporary or permanent.
So do we think with you saying that it's broader, that actually the current definition is too narrow? Does it need to be brought more up to date to take in these extra vulnerabilities that maybe weren't considered vulnerabilities at the time?
I think so, yeah. I think there has been a bit more of a focus in line with consumer duty to broaden that beyond what it previously has been in the past. But yeah, it could definitely be a bit more brought forward in how we're discussing this from case to case.
I think it's almost like the more you try to define it, the narrower it becomes, because you can't say, oh, these are the situations you need to consider, because there's so many variabilities, and it's more about being able to assess, is there something about this client that puts them in this situation? And the more you try and make that into a tick box approach, I think the less meaningful it becomes.
And also, I suppose, if you are doing that and making it more narrow, you're almost like precluding people, because if they don't fit into that tick box narrative, but there is something that they might feel vulnerable, or it might be a very niche set of circumstances, are they just not included? By anything, if you're making it smaller, you're almost making it harder for people to be in that bracket anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's on the advisor. It's hard for us as paraplanners, especially for outsourcers, when you never have that face-to-face contact with the client to make that assessment. And so you're reliant on the advisor doing that. And we see so many different approaches to how that's done.
I think with you saying, Alan, about especially as outsourcers, or even if you're an in-house paraplanner and you're not in the meeting, I suppose, is there a way that we can assess that vulnerability ourselves when we're getting client files in? Is there anything that we can be looking for as someone who's never sat with the client, never met them? Are there any signs that we should be kind of keeping an eye out for to make sure that we are covering all the topics?
Yeah, I think there are situations where there's something on the file that maybe the advisor hasn't considered. So for us, we'll give the advisor a call and talk that situation through and say, there's potential vulnerability here. Had you considered such and such? Because you can get those clues, I think, from the fact finder, but you're not necessarily in a position to make a conclusion from it.
And I think part of our process perhaps is just to ensure that discussion has been had, and to just keep going back. Perhaps the advisor, if there's no comment either way, to just ensure that is recorded, that it's been looked into.
I think one of the things that I've seen on files are things that maybe I would pick up as markers for vulnerability, that maybe the advisor, because this spectrum is so defined, if they're looking for, the 4 main areas of vulnerability and they're not looking past that. So, for example, we had a situation where a client had made a comment about not understanding something, and the advisor had then written in the notes, something along the lines of, but we talked about it and now they understand it. But actually, because of the client's circumstances, and I can't remember exactly what they were, but it was this point where we were like, well, hang on, do they understand it? Have you asked them to sort of not repeat it back, but to have that conversation afterwards in, the next time you see them, just to clarify that they do know what's going on. And actually, is this something that, although it doesn't sit in the brackets of vulnerability, quote unquote, they're still being, picked up on that marker. And actually, I suppose then that goes into the question of how do we have that conversation with the advisors as paraplanners, because we don't want to be seen to be overstepping, but we don't want to do a disservice to the client either. Either of you had a situation where you've had to kind of step in?
We've had situations where we've had to go back to the advisor and say, yeah, there's a vulnerability or potential vulnerability here. And when you talk it through, they've agreed, but it's maybe not something that they've seen at the time. And I think in the meeting and in the moment, there's so many things to be thinking about. And so some advice firms have put a process in place to try and make sure that things are captured. That's when I feel that it can get a bit tick boxy. And sometimes they talk to the client about vulnerability, which I don't think is the right thing to do.
I don't think you meant to do that, are you?
No, well, it's the same goes for putting it in suitability reports. We shouldn't be saying to a client, you are vulnerable, so whatever the conclusion is, it's just about identifying what you need to do to make that situation okay.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, we've had fairly robust in-house processes, but again, quite limited in the scope of it. So over 75 offered to have a family member at a meeting. That's quite a typical one.
But also, not every single person not every person over 75 has someone that they trust, I suppose, enough to sit in on that. But also, not every 75-year-old is what I would class as vulnerable personally. Like, I look at people I know at 75 that differ massively on how much they understand, how much they know. I think to have this tick box, I feel like we're rewriting the FCA situation here on vulnerability, but to have this tick box almost makes you consider them in a different light rather than judging them as a client individually, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. That policy did get updated to, it just became a flag for when to look out for it, and, not something you'd mandatory to do on every case. But yeah, I think it's just getting a robust procedure in house for how you flag it, when to bring it up. I think there's also a big argument, as with anything, for inclusion by design. So just to make sure that everything you do is easy to understand, that people are, given the time that they need to talk through things, that reports are easy to read, you're using a good size font, that there's plenty of time for questions. I think as much as you can do with that is going to help the situation.
I really like that phrase, inclusion by design. I think that's great. I think it's easy to forget because we see suitability reports day in, day out, that when they land on somebody's doormat or in their inbox, that to be asked to read something that's, maybe 2 pages long is actually quite overwhelming for a lot of people who aren't used to seeing this kind of thing. And it feels like maybe a bit of a chore. It's something to have to get yourself in the right frame of mind and go, right, okay, I'll try and read this.
Yeah, get a cup of tea and concentrate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we can do a lot for clients by inclusion by design. But I do think that where companies, and maybe this is kind of compliance led, if you try and put a tick box approach in place for things to consider, then the broader considerations can fall by the wayside. And it's more human than that, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that comes up time and time again is, I suppose, how do we distinguish? We talk about tick boxes and having this very, very narrow way of looking at it, but how do we distinguish between someone who is genuinely vulnerable or someone that just maybe is a bit overwhelmed because it's a very long document to read, or there's a lot of information coming in and they just need some time to process it? How do we distinguish between the two? And is that why maybe vulnerabilities get missed, because we're confusing genuinely vulnerable people with someone who may just be a bit overwhelmed because it's the first meeting that they've ever had with a financial advisor and they're learning all these new terms or whatever? Do we think that's something that happens, or?
Yeah, I was thinking of a recent case where the client had got divorced and ticked all the paper boxes for being a vulnerable client, but actually her marriage had been bad for some years. There were all sorts of impacts from that on her. And having come out of that, she was in a much better place personally and able to make her own decisions. And I think maybe she's vulnerable in that she's had a significant change in circumstances, but actually it was for the better. And it didn't feel appropriate to put in that you need to have somebody with you. I'm not sure whether that's a vulnerability or not. I think that's one of the places where maybe the advisor is the person who's best positioned, having been in that meeting, to have that conversation with them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, because divorce is one of the main criteria down for vulnerability. And for some people, it's really empowering and it's a good turn of events for them. So nothing is really that black and white in this whole conversation, I think.
I think that's how it's been put out there, hasn't it? These are the 4 criteria. Do you hit any of these targets? And if you do, then you must be vulnerable. But by having the conversation with the actual client and saying, well, how do you feel about this? In the same vein, if you've lost somebody, they could have been ill for years. And although it's still very traumatic that person has passed away, it could be a bit of a relief as well because they've been suffering or whatever. So they're not always these like long-term negative problems.
I guess it could be a positive thing because I remember a case, this is going back before vulnerability was really talked about widely in financial services, where the couple had a win on the lottery. They'd won a substantial amount of money, but they hadn't had money before. So it was a good thing that happened to them, but they were vulnerable. And the advice they received at that time was actually not good. And this became a complaint at a later date. So I guess it's not necessarily just negatives that make somebody vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that these events, divorce or a windfall, something like can be a positive vulnerability. Is that a bit of an oxymoron? But they can be. And that's actually maybe the way we need to start looking at certain life events and basing it on the actual client rather than just...
And does that affect your ability to make decisions about your finances? Some of these things that we've, just because you've had a change of life events, maybe you've got a lot going on, but does that mean you can't make decisions about your money and that you can't understand?
It might actually empower you to make, I don't want to say better decisions, but...
Different ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, more focused decisions for yourself.
And we've had clients in their 80s who have managed their portfolios themselves for most of their lives, and they get to the point they don't want to do that anymore, but they still have a high level of experience and knowledge. Whereas you might have somebody who's come into a lot of money, but they've never had to make financial decisions before, and they don't really know what different products are. And they're taking advice, they're taking professional advice, but they are more at risk of being given poor advice, I suppose, because they're not in a position of knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. So in that vein, I suppose, do we think as paraplanners, we talk about how we can look at the case and how we can say, right, well, actually, we might see a vulnerability. Do you think that we should have some sort of behavioural finance training or learning to help us identify, like Laura, you've just said about, sometimes it could be seen as a positive. That's not something I had considered, but maybe if I'd had some training or done some CPD or some learning or something about behaviour, would that have helped? Is this something that we should be doing as paraplanners?
I know there is some quite good training out there and webinars you can do. I don't know if we're allowed to name providers or anything, but I've done some. When I joined the firm I'm at now, we have some sort of vulnerable client training that we go through as part of the onboarding process. There's some good webinars to talk about identifying the different types of vulnerability and what you can do. In terms of behavioural finance, I mean, I definitely think we ought to learn about that, but how far can we push that when that essentially comes back to the advisors really and their relationship and coaching the client with what they choose to do with their money? Yeah, I think that's probably something that we all should have a good knowledge on.
I think paraplanners have a lot more opportunity to be involved here when they're client facing and when they can be in the meetings, or even if they don't attend client meetings. So in my previous role as an employed paraplanner, although I didn't attend client meetings, I would speak to clients on the phone often. And that's often because they phoned up because something's changed in their life, something's happened. We can be in a position to take that into account. But when you've just got paper-based information, and for Hannah and myself as outsourcers, it's really difficult to make that judgment. But I think it's just assessing vulnerability is a very human thing. It's an emotional thing. And sometimes when you go through a file, you just think, there's something here. It's that kind of paraplanner's intuition, isn't it? There's just something that makes you think, hang on a sec. And that kind of training helps you be alert to those things. So yeah, I think that's really worthwhile and important for us to do.
I think, Alan, you were saying before about suitability reports. Obviously, we're not meant to write in the reports, you are vulnerable and therefore we are doing blah, blah, blah. How do we go about putting this information into a report compassionately, carefully, without literally saying, this is what the situation is? Or is there a way we do it?
Kind of don't at the moment. But I think where it's relevant, we can say we talked about because of your situation X, Y, Z, where it's appropriate to do so. Or, you prefer to have your son or daughter with you at the meeting. Otherwise, there's probably not. I think we're sometimes doing less and less on the writing out the personal stuff into the report and trying to keep it, to the concise, what we're recommending and why and how this meets your objectives, and not, doing the whole life story in the report so much. Yeah, your name is Brian. I think that's sort of, we're moving away from that side of things. So I guess there's a bit less scope to put things like that into the report.
We do the same. The assessment of vulnerability is on the file. And anything that we need to do as a result of that vulnerability being identified then comes through in how we explain things to the client, whether that means doing things in stages. So doing the first part of the advice and then waiting a bit before we move on to doing other stuff so that it can just go, okay, I've got my head around this bit. I'm good to move forward now. Or it might be that they need the report presented in a different way so that they can consume that information and understand it in a way that they might not be able to if they just had a standard suitability report, because if they're in a position of understanding, they can make a good decision. So we don't tend to put anything, I don't think I've ever used the word vulnerability in a suitability report. And I don't think I'd go much further than saying the reason why maybe someone else was in the meeting. You wanted your children to be present in the meeting because this had just happened and they were there for some moral support and they're helping you to make decisions about whether my advice is right for you. I think that's the most you need to say.
I guess unless it comes straight down to power of attorney and then you're writing the report quite differently, aren't you? So I suppose that's the truly vulnerable client.
And I suppose we're sort of, and I think this goes back to maybe the way that we were taught when vulnerability became more of a topic that was talked about. I feel like we always go back to it being old people or health-based, but actually there are probably some very vulnerable younger people out there who are just maybe starting to work with financial advisors and planners who have absolutely no knowledge. And, that in itself, I think we sort of forget that that's a vulnerability as well. Or someone who, I don't know, say has dyslexia or has something in those where you've got to, like you were saying before, both of you, about changing the font. Or we've had it before where I've checked a report from one of our team and been like, why is this font so big? And when I've read the notes, it said like, the client has poor eyesight and and she responds to this better. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. But at first it was like, what's going on here? The advisor had thought about that, had that conversation and agreed this is how we're going to make things easier for the client. But actually, it was a younger person. It was somebody that actually she wanted her to take the time to read the report, not just, like we hear so often, they don't read it. The advisor wanted the client to be able to physically do it. So, and I think we do talk about vulnerability in this vein of old people, poorly people. But actually, there's so many people probably coming into the industry that have no financial education. And how do we go about kind of bringing them in without dumping a 24-page suitability report on their doorstep?
We've I have a previous firm we experimented a little bit with PowerPoint presentation format reports, so a lot more visual. It could be presented to the client at a meeting. I think that was quite a creative and interesting way of looking at it, just to appeal a bit more to younger people. But I think I had a presentation recently that the most common learning style is visual learning. And to just accommodate different ways that people learn and take in information, I think it's a really good way to try and address this sort of thing.
I think we've started working with or trialing, say for annual reviews, sort of Canva templates or PowerPoints, but doing it much more graphics based. And as somebody who's a very wordy person, I find it very weird to look at and be like, there's very little writing on that. But the clients understand it because, for example, like we've got for attitude to risk, it's like the dial on your car, your speedometer, and each one is a number. And there's the blurb underneath about what it means to be a 6 out of 10. But for them to see I am a 6 and this is what that means, rather than have to read 2 or 3 paragraphs about what it means to be a 6. And I think actually that's been a really interesting, like, to get the feedback from the clients of the firms that we work with to say, I understood it a lot more this way, or, they're looking at literal graphics of pots of money and they can see, well, here you had this and now you've got that. Actually, I think it is starting to become, I've heard of firms doing videos and recording either the advisor talking about the work that they're doing and sort of going through it with them, or just recording themselves kind of like a live suitability report. I don't know. But it was interesting.
You can probably get AI to do that for you now, can't you? It can just take your face and speak your words for you, and we'll have verbal suitability reports.
Oh, don't say that. I keep telling people AI won't take my job. But God. But yeah, I think the visual, it's definitely happening, and I think because we talk about vulnerability from a old person, like I say, perspective, actually there are people coming in that need this financial education, and maybe having more visual reports is the way to help cover that vulnerability maybe.
Yeah, so it's another, coming back to the inclusion by design. But you mentioned about dyslexia as well, and considering the increase in awareness of neurodivergence over recent years, I think I've maybe once seen a client that had ADHD down on the file. There must be loads, and perhaps people aren't thinking to disclose it or to ask.
I think that's the other thing is they're not asking, but clients, obviously the advisors are not going to say, do you have a vulnerability?
Yeah.
But there will be like chronic conditions, there will be neurodiverse conditions that actually will impact what's happening and the advice process. But how do we get to that part of the conversation? Because people might think, oh, well, that won't affect financial services. That won't affect my money if I've got this, and this.
Oh, yeah. But ADHD very much does affect your money. Yes. I think it's maybe just trying to ask this small, inclusive type of questions that get people to open up, that you could ask to anyone. Do you need me to... I can't even think I'm trying to phrase it, but, like asking for reasonable adjustments. Do you need any particular communication style to...
I suppose it's like asking somebody if they need it in Braille, or if they, if they have eyesight problems.
My experience is similar to what you just said. The number of times that I've seen any neurodivergence documented on a file, I mean, it's few and far between. I think OCD a couple of times, ADHD, autism a couple of times, and dyslexia once. Just once ever. And I've been paraplanning for 20 years. It's just like, this is crazy, Do
we think planners are scared to ask, though? I mean, obviously not ask outright, do you have... But do we think it's a topic that's still maybe seen as, well, we just do it. We just don't ask because we don't want to offend anybody.
Right.
Yeah. Because actually, on a personal level, like I have ME, I'm very open about it. I know if I got a very long suitability report, it would not... go in my head at all. To sit and read it, I'd have to do it in chunks if I was not feeling so great. So actually, that is something that maybe needs to be considered if I was the client of a planner. So how do we... I don't know if there's a way that as paraplanners we can maybe put that out to... Maybe this is what this podcast is for, putting it out to the planners. Now, you need to ask these questions.
It'd certainly be nice to see that as a question, or as a standard question on a fact find. Because if you give a client a suitability report and they haven't told you they've got some problem or challenge, I suppose, in digesting that information, are they really fully informed? Do they know? And yeah, the advisor might have talked through the suitability report with them. They might have talked through, they will have talked through the advice with them. But
they could have zoned out halfway through that, and the advisor wouldn't
Yeah.
Not that it's not really interesting, but
no, I understand. So I'm chartered, but if someone sent me a 20-page financial report with my ADHD, I would physically recoil from that report. When we talk this up into a corner, everyone is vulnerable.
Well, yeah, maybe this is in some way, but I think it's about how do we challenge, because I think, and I've had this actually recently with someone I know, another outsourced paraplanner, when she has gone back to the advisor and said, actually, I'm not entirely sure what you've said is correct. I think it should. There's been a lot of pushback. And I think there are still people out there that see paraplanners, should just do what they're told and get on with it. So it's like, how do we say, have we asked these questions without overstepping, without, not saying all planners are like that at all. Most are very, very good at taking in it's very collaborative. But how do we have that conversation and say, have you considered this? Because it's maybe not something that would cross your mind to think about. I don't know if there's a way around that.
I don't want to give away all my good tricks, but highlighting that it's a compliance requirement works quite well. I mean, it is, and it's in the client's best interest, but that advisors want to make sure that their work is compliant, of course. So highlighting that.
Yeah, that's should be quite a straightforward one, I suppose.
I think, we work in a very complex industry and the goalposts keep moving and we all learn all the time, and that's paraplanners, advisors, and we have relationships with some of our clients where we're learning things together. You come across things all the time that are so unusual and quirky and that you've not seen before. And I think those are the good sort of relationships to have. That's how a paraplanner and an advisor can work best together. And so when you want an advisor to maybe reconsider their approach to something, or allow maybe their paraplanner to, in inverted commas, train them on something where maybe their thinking or their thought process needs to change a bit, that's something surely that should be welcomed.
Yeah.
You would hope. Yeah. I think as well, and definitely and I can only speak from an outsourced perspective, but one of the things that we do and we like to sort of say is, I've had this situation with another firm. This is how I would, I applied the situation, a solution to them.
Yeah.
Have we thought about applying it for your firm? And I think actually, because we work for lots of different people with lots of different ways of doing things, we probably have seen most scenarios. Mm-hmm. So for us, that's a way that we sometimes try and change minds, or, I don't want to say coerce them into the way that we're thinking, but have that conversation with people and say, look, we've seen this before. This is what we did last time. Have you thought about having this conversation with the client? Because actually, it needs to be done, really. And I'm now going to use your trick and it's a requirement by compliance. Laura says so.
I hope my advisors aren't listening to it. Yeah, but I think just working in a collaborative way and offering that additional layer of rationale, there shouldn't be any problem with that, should there? That's getting the best outcome for everyone, hopefully.
You would think so.
I like that approach of someone else is doing this, so
you don't want to miss out.
Might want to consider this too. Sometimes the only comments we have on a file about vulnerability are in notes that's been, I'm going to say, deduced by AI, and sometimes AI decides to use quite strong language in situations where it's maybe not appropriate. Have you come across this at all? I need
an example of this.
The client is extremely vulnerable to market movements, and it might make you think that the client's got no capacity for loss, but actually they just made a passing comment about, it wasn't good when Trump introduced those tariffs, and it's kind of extrapolated that to try and draw a conclusion. Yeah. And the conclusion is actually quite a long way from the actual situation. There's nothing else on the file to back up this conclusion that the AI has drawn.
I feel like I still personally take AI with a pinch of salt, purely because it still calls us power planners. And after all,
it's not what we're...
Well, and that's what my grandma used to call me. But it's, it still hasn't clicked that power planning is not what we do. So I do take, what it says. And actually, we've seen AI notes where it still says at the top, like, generated by AI might not be correct. And I always sort of go back to the advisor and say, have you checked this? Because actually, exactly as you just said, Alan, if it's giving you really, really strong markers for vulnerability, then actually that might not be the case in the slightest. That could change the whole outcome of what we're doing, really.
Yeah. I think that the point one of you made earlier about, is everybody vulnerable, is a really interesting one, because the focus, the FCA's focus on vulnerability, it's something that needed to be said. It's conversations that need to happen, but it is really broad. The edges are really grey. And isn't it just about being human and taking the time to think about the person you're communicating with? And that does apply to everybody.
I'm sat here nodding. It's a little bit like everything's urgent, but what's more urgent than, what's the most urgent? Everybody will have some vulnerabilities at some point in their life. And probably there will be some, but at all points of their life, but some are more vulnerable than others, if that makes sense. And I think everybody's on like a spectrum of vulnerability, I suppose, but it's just picking the ones that are going to, because also I always think you could be in a client meeting and you sign them up and everything's good and they go ahead with the advice you've given them. And then like the next day, God forbid, something could happen that then changes everything for them. So actually, it's about, obviously you can't foresee these things are going to happen, but it's about keeping up to date with that vulnerability and making sure that,
it's not a one-time job.
Exactly. Like, oh, well, last time you had this problem, so there we go. You must always be that. Like you said about the divorce or windfall or that kind of thing, like it could change very, very quickly. So one final question. We talk about, I feel like as paraplanners, we sometimes talk a lot about what we see done badly, but what do we see done well by advisors when they're documenting vulnerability and on the client files, how they deal with it, how they deal with the clients themselves? Let's end on a positive.
I really like to see bespoke written paragraphs, or something that's really the advisor's written it from scratch. It's entirely personal to that client, and they've said what's happening in that person's life and what might be going on in their head that could cause any issues, so that we've got a bit of insight into where they're at that point in their journey through life. You can't make assumptions about what's happening for people, but when the advisor has taken the time to really consider it and write out something that's personal, bespoke, it's not a tick box. It's this is what my client's dealing with at the moment, and this is how we're going to take that into account to make this better for them. That's ultimately what we're trying to achieve, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it.
Yeah, I just, I suppose, from my perspective, like, we've got clients of our clients that if something was to happen in their lives, I think it's a good sign. If something bad happens in their life, that their financial advisor is like one of the first people that they ring. That to me is a sign that the advisor and the planners have really understood this client's life and situation. Because actually, if you're going through a trauma, somebody's passed away, let's say, and the first person you pick up the phone to tell is your financial advisor. Yes, okay, there might be other reasons for doing it, but to me, that's a good sign that they've
really
done their job
of
right.
Trust, isn't it?
Absolutely. So that is all we have time for, although to be honest, I feel like we could have probably continued that conversation for a while. We really hope that you've enjoyed our conversation today, picked up a few ideas about how we as paraplanners can help spot the signs of vulnerability, support our financial planners, and genuinely make sure that clients feel heard and looked after. As always, massive thanks to Alan Gow and Laura McLeod for joining me and sharing their thoughts. It's clear that obviously vulnerability is not just a tick box exercise. It's something that we all need to approach with empathy, curiosity, and care. If today's episode has sparked something for you, we'd love to hear about it. On LinkedIn, you can join the PFS Paraplanners group and join in the conversation about anything we talked about today. And if you found this podcast useful, please share it with your team and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming up next. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep doing the brilliant work that you do behind the scenes. See you on the next episode of Inside Paraplanning.